Turkey on the table, oh what a sight. Cranberry sauce and everything's right. Uncle Joe telling jokes loud as a bull. Grandma's pie making everyone full. Kids running wild, tag you're it. Mom in the kitchen, a perfect fit. Dog stealing scraps from sister's plate. Laughter and love we appreciate. Happy Thanksgiving Day. Grateful hearts in every way. Family here will laugh and play. Thankful more than words can say. Stuffing faces with a rosy glow. Football reruns cause we all know after the feast it's nap time bliss. Waking up to leftovers we miss. Papa's stories from the past. Time flies by oh so fast. Cousins gossip, spill the tea. Life is sweet just like pecan tree. Under one roof, hearts align. Celebrate with food and wine. Sharing moments big and small. Grateful for one and all.
The Kahler Family Murders, a Thanksgiving nightmare. It was a cold November evening in 2009 when Dorothy Wright was preparing for what was supposed to be another peaceful Thanksgiving at her farmhouse in Kansas. Her kitchen smelled of roasted turkey and mashed potatoes, the aromas mixing with the crisp fall air that came through the cracked windows. The house was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the clinking of silverware, and the occasional shuffle of footsteps on the old wooden floors. Dorothy's heart swelled with anticipation as she arranged the plates on the table, setting a place for each member of her family: her daughter Karen, her grandchildren Emily, Lauren, and Sean, and of course, herself. After all these years, she had hoped that her family would enjoy another year together, especially after the recent tension she had noticed between Karen and her husband, Craig. Everything seemed perfect. The table was set, the food was ready, and Dorothy had a smile on her face as she gazed at the photographs on the walls. This was supposed to be a time of love and unity, but something was off. The family's unease. Despite the warmth of the house, Karen felt a knot in her stomach as she glanced around. The tension between her and Craig had been growing for months, maybe even years. It started small disagreements here and there, but over time, Craig's controlling behavior became unbearable. Karen had begun questioning how long she could keep up the facade of a perfect family, especially with the children noticing the strain. As Karen folded a dish towel in the kitchen, her mind raced. Should she even go through with this trip to Dorothy's? The last few months had been a blur of fights, threats, and Craig's escalating obsession with controlling every aspect of her life. She wasn't sure what had changed in him, if anything, but she knew she could no longer ignore the red flags. "Mom, are you all right?" Emily's voice broke through her thoughts. Karen looked up and forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm fine. Just thinking." Emily seemed unconvinced, but didn't press. She set the final dish on the table and joined her family for dinner. The small moment of calm was short-lived, however. The tension that built. Craig walked into the farmhouse quietly, his footsteps not quite matching the usual cheer of family reunions. His eyes seemed distant, like he was somewhere else entirely. For a moment, Karen couldn't even recognize him. This stranger standing in her doorway was no longer the man she had married. "Craig, you're here," Dorothy said warmly, stepping forward to embrace him. But Craig didn't seem to respond to her warmth. He simply nodded and moved past her, making his way into the living room. It was clear to Karen that something wasn't right, but she didn't want to ruin the moment. Not now, not on Thanksgiving. A family torn apart. Dinner started, but the usual laughter was absent. There were no jokes about family politics, no funny stories about the kids' childhoods. There was only the faint echo of clinking silverware and quiet conversations. Emily and Lauren exchanged worried glances, while Sean, oblivious to the tension, kept his head down, focusing on his food. Karen glanced at Craig, who wasn't eating. His gaze was fixed on his phone, something he never did during family gatherings. She could feel the familiar dread rise in her chest, the old, gnawing feeling that had been with her for years. She had hoped that this dinner, this time together, would provide a break from the storms at home. But instead, it felt like a countdown to disaster. She tried to catch his eye, to give him some sign that everything was okay. But Craig wouldn't meet her gaze. The silence between them grew unbearable. She knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. As much as she wanted to believe that this Thanksgiving could be different, she knew deep down that Craig had already decided otherwise. The beginning of the end. Later that evening, as everyone moved into the living room for dessert, a chill swept through the house. Karen was in the kitchen, cleaning up, when she heard the click of the front door. For a moment, she thought it was just the wind. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. And then, the metallic clink of a rifle being set down on the hallway table. The first shot. The next moments blurred into chaos. Karen rushed toward the sound of the rifle, but it was too late. Before she could make it to the hallway, she heard a loud crack, followed by a scream. Dorothy's voice, unmistakable and full of terror. "Craig, what are you doing?" The second shot was deafening. Emily screamed. Lauren gasped, and in the midst of the panic, Sean froze. Karen rushed into the living room, her heart pounding, her body shaking with adrenaline. She had to protect her children. She had to get them out of the house, away from Craig. But before she could reach the door, a third shot rang out. The escape. Sean, still frozen in place, was the first to move. He bolted for the back door, terrified and confused. Emily tried to grab him, but it was too late. She ran after him, pushing Lauren to the ground to avoid the path of the rifle's line of fire. Karen stood in the doorway, helpless, watching her children flee. Craig had already turned the gun on her mother, her sister, and now her own daughters. Sean stumbled down the path, still clutching a handful of coins he had been sorting just before the chaos started. His feet were heavy, his breaths erratic. His world, the one that had once been so simple and innocent, was now torn apart in the worst way possible. The aftermath. Sean reached a neighbor's house, breathless and shaking. His scream was the first sign of life after the violence. Jim and Patsy, the elderly couple who lived nearby, saw the terrified boy on their porch and immediately called the police. At that moment, the first responders were already on their way, and the search began. Karen, her heart shattered, stumbled through the back door after her children. But before she could escape, Craig locked eyes with her. The coldness in his gaze sent a chill down her spine. "Go, Karen," Craig said, his voice low and emotionless. "You were always the problem." The call to 911. Dorothy's frantic call to 911 was the last thing Karen would ever hear from her. The dispatcher's voice echoed through the phone as Karen bolted into the night, desperate to find her children. By the time the police arrived, it was too late for Dorothy. It was too late for Karen's sister Lauren, too. The investigators at the scene confirmed it, for bodies had been found in the house. Dorothy, Karen, Lauren, and Emily all taken by the same man. The manhunt begins. The manhunt for Craig Kahler began immediately. His truck was found a few miles away, abandoned and with the keys in the ignition. But Craig was nowhere to be found, as the town held its breath, wondering if Craig would turn himself in or if he was planning to escape into the night. Karen's thoughts were with her children. Would they be safe? Would Sean and Emily ever recover from what they'd witnessed? And most haunting of all, why had Craig chosen them to die? The police arrive. As the first responders flooded the farmhouse, their faces were masked with disbelief. The scene before them was more grisly than they could have ever imagined. Dorothy Wright, once the proud matriarch of the family, lay lifeless in the kitchen, a pool of blood surrounding her frail body. The Christmas decorations she had so carefully hung were now marred by the chaos of violence. In the living room, Karen Kahler, the daughter of the beloved Dorothy, had met the same fate. Her body was sprawled on the floor, a testament to the horror she had lived through and her final moments. Lauren, the youngest of the daughters, was found upstairs, clinging to life. Despite the best efforts of emergency personnel, Lauren passed away shortly after, leaving only Sean and Emily as survivors. The search for Craig, The question on everyone's mind was simple. Where was Craig Kahler? When the police arrived, there was no sign of him. His truck had been found a few miles away, parked near a wooded area. But Craig was nowhere in sight. The officers quickly began to canvass the surrounding area, alerting neighboring counties to be on the lookout for the suspect. As they combed through the scene, it became clear that this wasn't an impulsive act of violence. This was calculated, planned. Craig had taken the time to hide his tracks, covering his escape route. But where had he gone? Was he running? Or was he still lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next move? The call to action. The police set up a command center and issued an all-points bulletin for Craig. They identified his car and provided details of his appearance. Local news outlets began to pick up the story, and soon, the case became a nationwide tragedy. Speculation swirled around Craig's motives, and people across the country began to search for answers. In the small town where the Kahler family had once been considered the epitome of middle-class success, the shockwaves were still reverberating. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy. The family, once so full of life and promise, was now reduced to a tragic headline. What had driven Craig to do this? Was it a sudden snap of anger, or was it the culmination of years of hidden abuse? The children's perspective. At the hospital, Emily Kahler sat quietly in a sterile room, her body still in shock from the events of the previous night. She couldn't comprehend what had happened. One moment, her family was together, and the next, her world was shattered. Emily, despite the trauma, was trying to process the events, but her thoughts were muddled, and the grief weighed heavily on her chest. The sound of gunshots, her grandmother's scream, the cold look on her father's face, her feet pounding against the ground as she ran with her younger brother. The sight of Lauren lying lifeless, her final breath taken far too soon. Sean, barely 10 years old, was still too young to fully understand the gravity of what he had witnessed. He hadn't seen the details, but the images of his father holding the gun, of his family being torn apart, would stay with him forever. It was a nightmare he couldn't escape, even in the safety of his grandparents' home, where he had been taken to recover. Sean's silence. For Sean, it was even harder. He couldn't speak about what had happened. His mind had blocked out most of the horrific images, but his heart knew the truth. His father had killed the people he loved most, and Sean was left to face the painful reality that his life had been permanently altered. Sean couldn't even bring himself to say the words aloud. In a way, he felt guilty for having survived, for having escaped while the others hadn't. He couldn't understand why his father had chosen to spare him, why he was the one left alive. He sat in silence, his eyes vacant as he stared at the window, the world outside still turning, oblivious to the tragedy that had taken place in his home, the family's fight for justice. Emily, on the other hand, knew she had to be strong for Sean. She was the older sibling, the one who had always taken care of him. Now, she felt the responsibility weigh on her shoulders even more. She needed to speak for her mother, her sister, and her grandmother. She couldn't allow her father to get away with this. The Kahler family had always been known as a model family. No one could have predicted that it would be torn apart by violence. Yet here they were, left with the wreckage of a crime that no one could fully comprehend. Emily's mind raced. She knew her father, she knew his temper, his possessiveness. But what had happened to make him cross this line? Was this a crime of passion, or had it been brewing for years? The manhunt begins. The manhunt for Craig Kahler intensified as the search spread across neighboring states. With a history of domestic violence and controlling behavior, the authorities feared Craig could be a threat to anyone he came into contact with. His escape route was uncertain, and the police were left scrambling for leads, witnesses, and clues. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Craig in the area shortly after the murders. His truck had been spotted at several gas stations and diners, but by the time law enforcement could track him down, he had already disappeared. The police were left with few clues. They began to analyze the messages he had sent to his wife, Karen. In the days leading up to the murders, some were desperate, others threatening, all showing signs of a man losing control. One particular message stood out. "You'll regret this. You're not leaving me." It was chilling to think that Craig had already made up his mind about his actions. Before that fateful Thanksgiving, the silent search. The search for Craig Kahler continued in silence, with law enforcement working tirelessly to track down any leads. Helicopters flew overhead, sweeping the countryside for any sign of the suspect. As the investigation deepened, the pieces began to fall into place, but there was still no sign of Craig. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Emily and Sean remained under heavy sedation and observation. They were both too young to fully understand the complexities of what had happened, but the police needed their statements. They needed to know what had transpired in those final moments before the violence erupted. A family's devastation. The media coverage of the tragedy intensified. National news outlets began to pick up the story, drawing comparisons to other family annihilator cases, such as John List and Chris Watts, whose shocking crimes had also left families torn apart. The Kahler family story became a grim reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk behind closed doors. But for Emily, Sean, and the rest of the Kahler family, the press coverage was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept the case in the public eye, increasing pressure on law enforcement to find Craig. On the other hand, it subjected them to constant scrutiny, their personal lives laid bare for the world to see. The search continues. The investigation into Craig's motives became more complex as the days passed. Was this the result of a mental breakdown, or was it premeditated? Had Craig been plotting this for months, waiting for the right moment to act? Law enforcement officials struggled to find the answers, but they knew one thing for certain: Craig was dangerous, and he needed to be found before he could hurt anyone else. A break in the case. Finally, a breakthrough came. A tip from a local motel manager in a neighboring state had led them to a remote cabin in the woods. The manager reported a man matching Craig's description checking in under a false name. By the time the police arrived, Craig was gone, leaving behind only a few belongings and a trail of footprints leading deeper into the forest. The final showdown. The search for Craig reached a fever pitch as law enforcement closed in. But Craig's mental state was deteriorating. His erratic behavior grew more unpredictable, and he became more determined to escape, even if it meant taking others down with him. As the police set up a perimeter around the area, the final confrontation loomed. Would they find Craig before it was too late? Or would the Kahler family's nightmare become even darker? The final hours. As the days dragged on, law enforcement's patience wore thin. They had chased every lead, followed every clue, but Craig Kahler was still elusive. The search had grown more desperate, with local, state, and even federal officers combing the countryside, looking for signs of Craig in every corner of the region. The authorities now had a much clearer understanding of Craig's mental state. His behavior had become erratic and dangerous in the months leading up to the murders. His obsession with control over his wife, Karen, and his belief that she was betraying him had reached a breaking point. The family that had once been a picture of suburban perfection was now shattered. The pieces scattered across the countryside as Craig fled into the woods, a man on the edge. Every night, the Kahler family's faces were on the news. The image of Dorothy, Karen, and Lauren, all taken too soon, haunted the public. But it was Emily and Sean's faces that stuck in people's minds the longest. They were the survivors, the ones who had witnessed the horror unfold. The world watched them in sympathy, but also in hope, praying that they would find the strength to face what had been done to their family. The breakthrough. The police were no closer to capturing Craig. They had combed through motels, abandoned houses, and even remote cabins, following every lead. But it wasn't until a local hiker, far out on a forest trail, stumbled across a torn receipt for a gas station that they finally caught a break. The receipt had been discarded along a dirt road, not far from the forest where Craig was suspected to be hiding. The gas station clerk, upon being shown a photo of Craig, immediately identified him. Craig had stopped there just days before, filling up his truck. The clerk recalled the unsettling look in his eyes, a man whose mind was clearly unraveling. The police finally had a clear path. Craig was hiding in the hills of the nearby mountains, a remote area with few trails and even fewer inhabitants. The authorities set up a perimeter and began a coordinated search effort, tracking dogs, helicopters, and local police scoured the rugged terrain. Emily's struggle. Meanwhile, Emily was still reeling from the horror. She sat in the quiet of her hospital room, staring at the wall. The doctors had cleared her of any physical injuries, but the emotional scars were much harder to treat. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see her mother's face, frozen in that final moment. Her voice cut off by the sound of the gunshots. She hadn't spoken much in the days following the attack. When the police had come to interview her, Emily could barely remember the details. Her mind had blocked out the worst parts: the moment Craig raised the rifle, the look on his face, the scream of her grandmother. Instead, she focused on her brother, Sean. Despite his young age, Sean had witnessed the carnage unfold, and Emily could see the trauma etched in his small face. He had become even more withdrawn, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Emily's heart broke for him. She wanted to protect him, but in the back of her mind, she knew that no one could protect him from the kind of pain they had both suffered. They would need each other to survive this, if they could survive it at all. The gathering storm. The days leading up to the search's conclusion were filled with mounting tension. The police knew the time was running out. Craig was becoming more desperate with each passing hour, and there was no telling what he might do next. They had to act quickly before he hurt anyone else. The tension was palpable. Craig's mind was unraveling, and the more cornered he felt, the more dangerous he became. The authorities feared that if they didn't capture him soon, he might turn his anger on anyone who crossed his path: friends, strangers, or even his own family. The confrontation. The moment the authorities had been dreading arrived on the morning of December 1st, 2009. Craig Kahler was found. The search team had closed in on the area where Craig was believed to be hiding. A small team of officers, including Sheriff Randall, approached the base of the mountains. Their movements were cautious. Too many lives had been lost already, and they didn't want to repeat their mistakes. The helicopter overhead surveyed the dense forest, picking up on any movement below. Sheriff Randall, who had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, could feel the weight of the situation. His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped his radio. "This is it," he muttered under his breath. "We're close." Craig's last stand. As the officers moved closer to the suspected location, they spotted Craig. He was alone, his face a mask of exhaustion and madness. His once imposing frame now appeared gaunt and disheveled, the wild look in his eyes a stark contrast to the man he had been. Craig saw the police approaching, and a cold smirk appeared on his face. He didn't raise his hands in surrender. Instead, he gripped his rifle tighter, as if daring the officers to make their move. In that moment, Sheriff Randall knew they had to act fast. Craig Kahler wasn't going to go down without a fight, and if they didn't stop him now, there would be more lives at risk. The officers took cover, and a tense standoff unfolded. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the sound of distant helicopters and the crunch of snow underfoot. Craig's eyes darted from one officer to the next, calculating, assessing. "You think you can stop me?" Craig sneered, his voice rough from days of isolation. This is how it was always going to end. But Sheriff Randall was ready. He signaled to his team, and the officers began to encircle Craig. The tension mounted. Seconds felt like hours, and the weight of the moment was unbearable. Suddenly, the shot rang out. A single bullet, fired from Craig's rifle, narrowly missed one of the officers. The standoff had turned into a firefight. Officers returned fire, and Craig, despite his exhaustion, fought back with everything he had left. The exchange was brief. Within moments, Craig Kahler was surrounded, his rifle no longer in his hands. The officers moved in quickly, securing him in cuffs. As they did, Sheriff Randall took a deep breath. The manhunt was over. The capture. Craig Kahler was taken into custody, his face expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a deep fury. He was silent as he was led into the back of the police car, the realization finally sinking in that his rampage had come to an end. But the damage was done. The Kahler family was forever scarred by the violence Craig had unleashed. Emily and Sean would have to live with the trauma of witnessing their father's actions. The town, once a peaceful place, would never be the same. The aftermath. The town of Weatherford, Kansas, was still reeling from the effects of the tragedy. The Kahler family had been a fixture in the community, and now their name was associated with violence and horror. It would take years for the scars of that Thanksgiving night to fade. But for Emily and Sean, the real battle was just beginning. As they moved forward, they would have to find a way to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. Emily, now the guardian of her younger brother, felt a deep responsibility to protect him. But she also had to find a way to heal herself. The trial of Craig Kahler was a drawn-out process. His defense team argued that his mental health issues played a role in the murders. But the prosecution had a different perspective. They saw a man who had crossed a line and taken the lives of those who had once loved him. In the end, Craig was sentenced to life in prison, where he would continue to appeal his conviction, all while showing no remorse for the destruction he had caused. Emily and Sean's future. As the years passed, Emily and Sean slowly began to heal. They stayed with their grandparents, finding a semblance of normalcy again. Emily, though forever changed, went on to finish her education. Sean, though still haunted by his memories, grew into a young man with his own dreams. They would always remember the Thanksgiving that took everything from them, but they also learned to hold on to each other and cherish the family they still had. The trial begins. The courtroom was silent as Craig Kahler sat in his defense chair, his eyes cold and detached. The trial had begun months after his capture, and the town of Weatherford was watching closely. This was the case that had torn apart the community, and now they would witness the painful process of justice unfolding. At the defense table, Craig's attorney argued that his client had suffered from severe mental health issues: bipolar disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and depression, which had contributed to the murders. The defense sought to paint Craig as a victim of his own mind, a man driven to violence by forces beyond his control. But the prosecution was ready. They argued that Craig's actions were not the result of an uncontrollable mental illness. Rather, they were the culmination of years of control, manipulation, and narcissism. They pointed to the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, the purchase of ammunition, the hiding of the gun, the fact that Craig had meticulously planned the murders, and the chilling message he had left behind when he was captured. "I had to do it. She was never going to leave me." The prosecution's case. The prosecution's first witnesses were the first responders, who described the horrors they had found when they arrived at the scene. They painted a picture of the brutal violence, the lifeless bodies of Karen, Dorothy, and Lauren, and the chaotic aftermath. The emotional weight of their testimony was evident. Detective Harris, one of the first officers on the scene, struggled to maintain his composure as he recounted finding Lauren clinging to life in the upstairs bedroom. He spoke about how she had whispered, "Craig, my dad," just before she died. The prosecution also introduced the 911 call made by Dorothy, just moments before her death. The desperate voice of the elderly woman pleading for help as Craig shot her and her family echoed through the courtroom. The room was silent as the haunting words filled the air. "He's shooting us. Please help." Dorothy's voice had crackled through the line. Before the call abruptly ended, the jury could hear the panic in her voice, the realization that there was no escaping the horror Craig had unleashed. The evidence was damning. Craig had no alibi. There were no mitigating circumstances, no moments of madness that could excuse his actions. This was not a case of a sudden outburst, it was a calculated execution of his own family. The defense's struggle. Craig's defense team worked hard to paint him as a man pushed to the brink by years of mental illness. They called mental health experts to testify that Craig had been suffering from untreated bipolar disorder and severe depression, which they argued contributed to his delusional thinking and violent outbursts. They painted a picture of a man who had been a prisoner of his own mind, struggling with a sense of betrayal as his wife, Karen, began her relationship with Sonny Reese. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They argued that Craig's mental state did not excuse his actions. The evidence was clear. Craig had planned the murders. He had purchased a gun, hidden it, and taken steps to cover up his actions. His control over Karen had escalated over the years, and when he couldn't control her anymore, he resorted to violence. The psychological toll on Emily and Sean. For Emily, the trial was a painful reminder of the night that had destroyed her family. She had to take the stand and recount the events of that Thanksgiving night, the horror she had witnessed, the moments of confusion, the frantic escape with her brother. It was a moment of catharsis for her, but also one of profound pain. As she spoke, her voice trembled. She described her father, the man who had once been her protector, now reduced to a cold killer. The memories of his empty gaze and his indifference to her mother's screams were burned into her mind. Sean, still deeply affected by the trauma, couldn't bring himself to speak at the trial. He sat in the back of the courtroom with his grandparents, his eyes fixed on the floor, his mind somewhere far away. He had trouble understanding why his father had done what he did, why he had killed the people who had loved him. For Emily, the weight of responsibility had been heavy. She was the one who had survived, the one who had witnessed the destruction of her family. She had to live with the pain of knowing that her father had taken everything from her. But despite the emotional burden, she was determined to be strong for her brother. She wanted to make sure that Sean had a chance at healing. Craig's justification. Throughout the trial, Craig remained eerily calm. He showed no emotion as witnesses testified, as the prosecution presented evidence of his actions, as the defense tried to paint him as a man driven to madness. But his behavior on the stand was what shocked everyone. Craig tried to justify his actions. He said that Karen had betrayed him, that he had been pushed to the edge by her affair with Sonny. In his mind, he wasn't the villain, he was the victim of a world that had turned against him. He spoke about how he had saved his son, Sean, from what he believed was a toxic relationship with Karen. "I didn't want to do it," Craig said, his voice surprisingly steady. "But she was going to leave me. She was going to take everything. She left me no choice." The words were chilling. Craig believed his actions were justified, and he had no remorse for what he had done. He saw himself as a hero, someone who had made a hard choice to preserve his family, even if it meant destroying it. Emily's impactful statement. On the final day of the trial, Emily was called to give her victim impact statement. She had struggled with the decision to speak, but she knew it was her responsibility to do so. She stood in the witness box, her hands clenched at her sides. As she looked at the man who had once been her father, she spoke slowly, carefully choosing her words. "My father was a monster. He took everything from me. He took my mother. He took my sister. He took my childhood, and he took the man I thought he was." Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. "I don't care what his excuses were. He murdered my family, and I will never, ever forgive him." It was the moment the entire courtroom had been waiting for. The audience was silent as Emily's words echoed through the room. In that moment, she found her strength, her ability to confront the man who had destroyed her family, and to stand up for the memory of those she had lost. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just a few hours before reaching a verdict. The room was packed with reporters, family members, and victims' advocates. Emily and Sean sat with their grandparents, holding each other's hands, anxiously waiting for the decision. The judge finally entered the courtroom, and the room fell into complete silence. He called Craig Kahler to his feet. The jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. The words sent a wave of relief through Emily's body. The trial had been long and painful, but in that moment, justice had been served. Craig would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As the courtroom began to empty, Emily found herself holding onto the small shred of justice she had been searching for. It wasn't going to bring back her mother, her sister, or her grandmother, but it was a step toward healing. Life after the trial. In the years following the trial, Emily and Sean slowly began to rebuild their lives. They moved away from Weatherford, seeking a new start. Emily went on to finish her education, eventually becoming a child advocate. She used her voice to help other children who had been victims of domestic violence, driven by the memory of what her own family had endured. Sean, now a young adult, still carried the scars of the night, but he was determined to move forward. He found solace in music, using it as a way to process his emotions. The two of them, despite the pain, learned how to be there for each other. Craig's legacy. As for Craig, he continued to appeal his sentence from death row, still holding onto the belief that he was justified in his actions. His letters from prison showed no remorse, no understanding of the devastation he had caused. He still saw himself as the hero of his own twisted narrative. But for Emily and Sean, the trial had been the first step toward closing the door on their past. They knew they would never forget, but they could find a way to live again together. The brutality, the illusion, and the consequences. The tragic events of the Kahler family were not just a senseless act of violence, but a chilling reminder of the destructive power of control and obsession. Craig Kahler, once a husband and father, became a murderer not out of some simple instinct or crime of passion, but as a result of his delusion of ownership and entitlement. His brutal actions were not a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather the final product of years of abuse and manipulation. At the heart of the tragedy was a man whose overwhelming need to control his family turned into violence. His distorted view of loved one that saw his wife, children, and mother-in-law as possessions to control led to a bloodbath. The idea that he could somehow protect his son by eliminating his family shows the terrifying delusion that often accompanies severe mental health disorders and toxic relationships. Craig's view of love was twisted, seeing his destructive actions as justified, when in reality, they were the epitome of selfishness and irrationality. When control becomes the driving force in a relationship and it masquerades as love, it's easy to overlook the creeping dangers. Craig's actions were not those of someone caught in a moment of madness, but the culmination of years of psychological abuse, manipulation, and emotional control. The murder of Karen, Dorothy, and Lauren was the final, tragic result of Craig's belief that he could possess his family at any cost. The lasting pain, Emily and Sean. The emotional toll of the murders left Emily and Sean with scars that would never fully heal. Emily, who had lost her mother, sister, and grandmother in one night, was not only grieving the brutal loss of her loved ones, but also the crushing sense of betrayal by her own father, the man she had once loved and trusted. Sean, though still so young, was left with memories of things no child should ever witness. Emily, though only a teenager, found herself carrying an immense burden, the responsibility of taking care of her younger brother, protecting the memories of a happy family that now seemed like a distant dream. But the emotional weight of the tragedy was unbearable. Sean, still just a child, had lost his sense of safety and normalcy. His silence was a quiet testament to the weight of the trauma he had witnessed. Both of them were left with a haunting question. Why me? Why did I survive when others did not? Survivor's guilt became an invisible burden they carried. The psychological trauma was something that would remain with them forever, even as they tried to move forward. In the aftermath of this horrific tragedy, the question "what if?" loomed large. What if someone had seen the warning signs earlier? What if the controlling behavior, the emotional manipulation, and the red flags had been identified and addressed before it was too late? Domestic violence and psychological abuse often operate in the shadows, hidden beneath the surface of seemingly normal relationships. It can be easy to overlook the subtle signs, the emotional manipulation, the controlling behavior, the isolation of one partner. But these actions, though often subtle, build over time, creating a toxic environment that eventually leads to violence. Could this tragedy have been avoided if Karen had left Craig earlier? Perhaps. Could the warning signs have been detected before things escalated? Maybe. The question that lingers, though, is whether we, as a society, can do more to recognize these signs before they escalate to violence. The saying, "One can paint the skin of a tiger, but cannot paint its bones," suggests that while it may be difficult to avoid the outward dangers, like physical violence, it is even harder to prevent the core of the problem, the mental and emotional delusion that drives someone to justify such extreme actions. However, this doesn't mean that we can't take steps to mitigate or prevent the consequences. Early intervention and awareness are key in stopping such tragedies before they unfold. Preventing future tragedies, steps we can take. The Kahler family tragedy is a painful reminder of the consequences of unchecked domestic abuse and toxic relationships. However, it also provides an opportunity to reflect on how we can prevent similar tragedies in the future. Identifying early warning signs. Red flags often precede acts of violence. Controlling behavior, emotional manipulation, isolation from friends and family, and constant surveillance are all signs of emotional abuse. By recognizing these early signs, we can intervene before things escalate. Mental health resources. Mental health issues are often at the root of such violence. The tragedy shows us the importance of early intervention. For those struggling with untreated mental illnesses like bipolar disorder, depression, or narcissism, ensuring accessible mental health resources could prevent such cases from reaching this point. Community support. Communities need to be more proactive in noticing and intervening when they see potential signs of domestic abuse. Schools, workplaces, and neighbors must be educated to recognize abusive patterns and support those in need. Providing resources like domestic violence shelters and hotlines can give victims the courage to reach out before it's too late. Education and awareness. Educating individuals about healthy relationships and respectful boundaries can significantly reduce the occurrence of domestic violence. Teaching young people what constitutes an unhealthy relationship and encouraging open discussions about mental health can prevent future generations from falling into these cycles. Empowerment and self-advocacy. People trapped in abusive relationships need to understand their rights and how to seek help. Encouraging self-awareness and empowerment is key. It is important to create environments where victims of abuse feel safe and supported in coming forward without fear of retaliation or judgment. The legacy. Moving forward, the legacy of the Kahler family tragedy is not just about remembering the lives lost, but also about learning from what happened. Emily and Sean, despite their trauma, have become advocates in their own right. They are living proof that survivors can rebuild their lives, even when everything they knew has been torn apart. Emily, now an advocate for children affected by domestic violence, has used her voice to reach those who are still trapped in situations like hers. She is determined to break the cycle of abuse and provide others with the tools to recognize the warning signs before it's too late. For Sean, though still struggling with the weight of his memories, music has become his form of therapy. He finds solace in expressing his emotions through his art. And while he will never forget what happened, he is slowly moving toward a future where his past does not define him. Conclusion. The end of one story, but the beginning of many. As the Kahler family tragedy fades into the past, it serves as a reminder that domestic violence is a problem that affects many families, often hidden in plain sight. The key is awareness, education, and early intervention. The emotional scars of Emily and Sean will never fully disappear, but through their advocacy and their efforts to rebuild, they show us that even in the darkest moments, healing is possible. The question remains, what if we had acted sooner? What if we could have stopped Craig before he crossed that line? While we can't change the past, we can learn from it and work toward a future where tragedies like this one can be prevented. This final section offers a reflection on the tragedy, the lasting effects of Craig's actions, and what can be done to prevent future occurrences. It explores the psychological dynamics, the lessons we can learn, and how society can take proactive steps in recognizing the early signs of abuse. Would you like to revise or add more to any part of this? Or is there anything else you'd like to explore?